We are very pleased that Alberta has now agreed to commit to putting in place a price on pollution, at least with respect to heavy emitters. This does not affect the consumer-based price on pollution that will go into effect in Alberta. But it is, I think, a step forward in terms of ensuring that provinces across this country are taking action on climate change.
If they continue raising the tax, it will make our economy less competitive, and here's the problem. It just, at some point, it continues to lead to the flight of capital and carbon leakage, basically from our energy sector to the energy sector in the U.S. that does not have a carbon price.
A breakthrough of sorts today in relations between Ottawa and Alberta. The federal government has accepted Alberta's latest plan to tax the largest greenhouse gas emitters at $30 per tonne. I'd be really happy if it were $300 per tonne. But that passing grade can become a fail if the price doesn't rise by $10 in both 2021 and 2022. It also does not apply to consumers. So the feds will still impose a tax on Alberta fuels like gas and propane as of January 1st. I'm here with the Power Panel to discuss. Marty, Marie, Paul, and Kathleen. Kathleen, I'm going to start with you. The basic sort of moral of the story is they've got a plan for the next year that the feds have approved, but unless it goes up by $10 a year, it's not going to meet federal standards.
Except that it will go up. Jason Kenney essentially acknowledged that, because at the clip you ran after that, he went on to say, look, we oppose a hike. We're going to fight it in court, in the Court of Appeal, in sort of the shorter term, in the new year at the Supreme Court of Canada. But if we lose, he said, he's not, quote, closing the door to $40. Mm-hmm. And that suggests to me he's also not closing it to $50. He doesn't like it, but he would prefer to impose it himself. In other words, he'd prefer for Alberta to impose it than to have a federal regulatory system imposing it. And I think the word he used is bigfooting Alberta. So he very much wants to have the fight about jurisdiction, Vashi, but at the end of the day, he openly and readily acknowledged that if he loses, he loses. And it's going to have to go up.
How do you read that, Marie?
It's odd, because every time I think that Jason Kenney's kind of calming his tone, then he gets aggressive towards Ottawa again. It's a bit like he's being hot and cold, I find. Sometimes, like today, I agree with Kathleen. I also noticed that he said that. And he said, well, at the end of the day, we have to make a prudent judgment, because essentially we'd rather do it ourselves than have Ottawa do it for us, which is also Quebec's argument that it's a question of jurisdiction. But then so he seemed to be kind of quieting down today, but then I'm pretty sure when he comes here on Tuesday, he'll hike the tone again and kind of spike up this fight with Ottawa. It's hard to read. And I'm also starting to wonder if Jason Kenney might feel a little bit isolated in the Federation. There is a consensus to oppose Bill 69 in terms of jurisdiction, but there was no consensus this week about opposing a carbon tax straight through.
And can I just jump in again? Because I think this is important as well. I mean, there was a lot of discussion yesterday about the throne speech and the words that weren't in it and the words that were, and how it was interpreted. And Jason Kenney was asked about that today too. Yeah. And for him, it was a big nothing burger. At least that's what he's saying, right? He's going, yeah, they didn't mention Alberta, they didn't mention Saskatchewan, oil pipelines, but we know what provinces they were talking about. We know what natural resources include. We know what market access means. And at the end of the day, it's a throne speech, and we spend a lot of time parsing the vaguest document on the planet. And that you can argue that something's in it or not in it all day long. At the end of the day, it's when the rubber hits the road and we see actual concrete proposals.
But all that's interesting, because it's very different than how the leader of the federal Conservatives reacted, which
that's
was...
That's why I noted, though. But that's my point. I find it so interesting.
I just want to bring back to Marie,
that one that was striking, that Mr. Scheer was essentially ripping this throne speech and saying it was awful, and there was nothing for Alberta, and there was nothing for oil, and we shouldn't have a carbon tax at all. And then you have Jason Kenney saying, we'll have some sort of carbon tax, and we don't really care about words in the speech. We just want actions from Ottawa. That, to me, was interesting. It's also surprising coming from Mr. Scheer, because it's almost as if he didn't really take into account the results of the election and the follow-up within his caucus and his movement. Because a lot of Conservatives who are mad at him and want him to leave blame in part the fact that they judged that he didn't have a sufficient climate plan. So I was listening to his speech today and I thought, but isn't he just sort of giving more ammunition to people who say he didn't understand what happened in the election and he doesn't understand the need for a climate plan, even for a Conservative federal party? It was a bit odd. And then just to go back to my point about Jason Kenney maybe being a little isolated, you've seen New Brunswick take act of the results and say, fine, we'll have a carbon price. You've seen Doug Ford also kind of tone down the rhetoric against Ottawa.
Although he's still pursuing his
He's still
legal
pursuing,
fight,
but the tone has definitely changed. And I'm starting to wonder if Jason Kenney is thinking, am I really going to keep doing this all by myself? I don't know. But he might prove me wrong on Tuesday because he keeps changing his mind.
What do you think, Paul?
I'm struck by how much effort so many actors in the federal provincial field are putting into playing nice, at least compared to the worst they could possibly do, right? So Wilkinson, the new environment minister, would not have been the first federal environment minister to ignore provincial action and simply say, it's our way or the highway. He buys a year's worth of peace on a part of the file. That's better than nothing. And it suggests that Kenny was listened to when he came to Ottawa. On the throne speech, it's clear that the Bloc leader had specific asks of the federal government, and it was essentially cost-free to provide those. Not use the word oil. Apparently he has some kind of thing about that. And
well, we don't know if that was really a specific act. It's an accusation of the Conservatives, but I don't think anyone said that was a specific
That the
act.
Liberals did it, or that the Bloc was asking for it?
They're saying that the Bloc asked for
He was
the Liberals
pretty
not to mention
unequivocal.
oil.
He came on the show and he was like, I don't want to hear a pipeline. I don't want to hear anything more about the pipelines. I don't want to hear more about oil. He didn't say that words in there.
The other thing is specific language about the timing of a buyout for the supply management sector.
Yes, that I agree.
You know?
Yeah.
And so it's sending a general message that a meeting with this edition of the Trudeau government is not a waste of everyone's time. And that's a decent message to send, and it suggests that Chrystia Freeland's having some influence and maybe Anne McClellan in the transition. And, so that calms everyone down, including Jason Kenney. And the stupid shouting match we've had for the last month maybe won't last forever.
Kathleen's right, Marty. Like it was his remarks on the throne speech, as well as this carbon tax stuff. Even at the premiers, when he emerged from that meeting a few days, I think Monday it was, with the premiers, Mr. Kenney, the premier came out and was thanking the premiers of Ontario and Quebec specifically for having his back. Like it was a very different tone.
Absolutely, and I'm sort of projected as to read into why he's doing this a little bit of a digression. I work for a site called The Logic now. As Paul likes to say, subscriptions make nice gifts, but The Logic is a business-oriented thing. So part of my job is to read a lot of reports. So I read a report last week from the Conference Board of Canada, sort of a lay of the land of each of the provinces, and I'm thinking in my head, of course, cliche, Quebec's doing well, British Columbia as well, doing well, Maritimes, whatever. Alberta's not doing well at all. The Alberta headline was Trans Mountain to spark oil sands expansion. And it was very, very bullish on what's going to happen in Alberta for the next couple of years. So growth of 2.4% in 2020, growth of 3.1% in 2021. What does that say? To me, that says, it speaks to the fact that the whole idea of Alberta, being mad at the rest of the country and talking about separatism and all that kind of thing, that phenomenon rises and falls with the economy. So I have this feeling that sort of that sense that everybody's really angry and aggrieved in Alberta, I think that's going to go away in a fairly big hurry in the next couple of years. And I wonder if what you're hearing from Jason Kenney talking right now is whether he's sort of transitioning towards that type of mentality, because it's not going to last forever.
Let's not forget, he also seems very optimistic that he's going to get, he likes to call it an equalization rebate.
Yeah.
But of course, it's this calculation under the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. And it's worth noting, when Chrystia Freeland was here, 11 days ago, the estimate was around $1.7 billion he felt Alberta was owed, and then he tacked on another 251. Everyone get out their calculators. Today it was 2.4 billion, because it looks like he's gone back to it's gone up. So I don't know if he's just trying to build a little bit of room so he can average it out. But he seemed to suggest, he didn't say it was a done deal, but he seemed to suggest that the government seemed very open to it.
Yeah, and that's certainly the signal, Marie, that the government has sent. Kathleen's referring to this fiscal stabilization program, which in the past 2 weeks became the alternative to reopening and debating the equalization formula, because it actually is, it appears, something that the government can do without the consent of all the provinces. And then the provinces all got behind it anyway, and they all agreed, yes, that's great if the federal government can help. Just one of the ways in which now it seems there seems to be some consensus around approaching the federal government over these kinds of issues.
Yeah, and as you said, it's easier to do. And the result being also that Mr. Kenney today, when he was outlining sort of the priorities that he wants to discuss in Ottawa next week with his delegation, he didn't mention equalization. He mentioned this fiscal stabilization fund because I assume he knows it's an easier thing to get out of the government. And he probably, as Kathleen said, got some sort of indication from Minister or Deputy Prime Minister Freeland that there was wiggle room in there. We haven't really heard from Ms. Freeland or Bill Morneau at Finance if there is wiggle room, but they seem to know on their end that there might be.
They're not saying no.
They're not saying no. And so you do get a sense that Ottawa is trying to appease. 2 weeks ago, when they said they were willing to move on environmental evaluations under C-69, you do get a sense that there's some wiggle room. And in this case, for the Fiscal Stabilization Fund, it doesn't sound like there's a big downside to Ottawa agreeing to Jason Kenney's demands, as opposed to environmental evaluations where you would get progressive voters being upset.
What's money?
Money, but other than that, you don't risk angering another part of the country or another part of the electorate. It's just money.
Paul, last word to you.
Shout out to Trevor Toome, an Alberta political scientist.
He's great.
Who was the only person talking about the Fiscal Stabilization Fund a month ago, and now it's on everyone's lips.
Hear, hear.
This is why social science research is worth your tax dollar. I don't know. I think this has been a better couple weeks for the Federation than the several weeks that preceded it.
Good point. And on that, we will conclude. Thanks, everyone.
A positive note for once.
A positive note on this Friday evening. Thanks to our power panel this evening and our ever-optimistic Paul Wells for that. Marie Bastel,
that's my brand.
Kathleen Petty, Marty Patrick, and Paul Wells. Thanks, guys. We've got more on today's federal approval of Alberta's big emitters tax. How's the province characterizing the deal with Ottawa? Jason Nixon is Alberta's Minister of Environment and Parks. He joins us from Edmonton. Hi, Minister Nixon. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for carving out some time for the show.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me on.
So the federal government announced today that they had accepted your province's plan to tax heavy emitters, but they've accepted it basically for a year. They're going to review it thereafter because your plan doesn't increase yearly the way that the federal standards have set out. Are you going to increase the amount by which you tax heavy emitters in a year?
Well, we're going to have a conversation over the next few months with our large emitters and our partners across the province about just that. But what I can tell you is that our plan will be to do what we need to do to make sure that we regulate our industry here in the province of Alberta. As I was building TIER, I consulted all across the province with our partners in the industry, and they were very, very clear in one message to me, which is that they wanted to be regulated in the province of Alberta and not by the federal government. So obviously, within reason, we will do everything possible to be able to keep our industry here at home.
What held you back from today announcing that the heavy, or in the past, or in October when you submitted the plan, simply announcing that this will comply with federal standards and each year it'll go up $10?
We want to have a bigger conversation about where we're headed on this file. I mean, at the end of the day, our argument continues to be when it comes to climate change, that provinces can regulate these issues here within their own provinces. Alberta led the way on this issue. We were the first province to do anything on emissions management, and we're proud of that. We think that we are in the best position to be able to make sure that our industry succeed while protecting the environment. And so, as this develops over the next couple months, there are other components over the overall emission portfolio in the province that has to be considered. And then we will have a conversation with the federal government once we've finished that consultation on which direction Alberta will go in the coming years.
If I'm reading between the lines, and correct me if I'm wrong, are you waiting for the outcome of the court case before you decide if you're going to comply with increases?
Well, I think the outcome of the court case is an important factor, certainly, and so we'll be watching that closely. The reality is that the court case fits in with, our argument about the ability of a province to be able to handle these issues within our own jurisdiction, and so that will have a factor in our final decision. But the overall parameters for us will continue always to be to make sure that our industry is regulated here at home.
Industry has said very clearly that the one thing that they want most is certainty. Actually, oil companies like Shell and Suncor have come out in support of a carbon tax. Why not just set out what they can expect over the next 5 years when you have the chance now, if industry is the primary concern?
Well, there's different levels of industry. And so when we look at TIER and the large industrial organizations that fall under TIER, there's 127 facilities in our province. That's just one issue in the context of this. And I've heard loud and clear the need for certainty, and I will continue to make it clear that we will do everything possible to make sure that we continue that certainty and to regulate our large emitters here in the province of Alberta. But there's also conventional oil and gas facilities and other facilities all across the province. On the conventional oil and gas side, 35,000 facilities in this province alone, and they have different needs. And so we don't want to make a blanket statement for the entire industry right now while we're having the overall conversation, including legal conversations within the courts when it comes to carbon taxes. And so we want to get all those facts together, have a broad conversation across the province, and we'll make a decision together, certainly in partnership with industry. But we're not going to be rash and move forward at a rapid pace until we understand all the chess pieces that are on the board.
With respect, though, I mean, if you wanted to create certainty, you could say what to expect in the next 3 years. All you've done is create certainty for a year.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. The only thing I can do to add to that, though, is to again make clear to the industry that we will take whatever steps necessary to make sure that we regulate here in the province of Alberta. But unfortunately, we are in a situation around uncertainty because of the way the federal government has continued to approach the carbon tax issue. And we're in court, and that alone puts us in a situation of uncertainty that's outside of our control. But what we can do is make clear that we will do everything in our power to make sure that we regulate our industry here in the province of Alberta.
I take your point, but the federal government has now been taken to court by 2 other provinces, and in both those decisions, the judges and the court ruled in favor of the federal government.
Yeah, I think Alberta is a little bit unique, though, and it's going to be interesting to see how that progresses. And what I mean by that is Alberta has a long history of already tackling emission management inside this country, more so than any other province inside the country. And that really, at the end of the day, if you look at the Saskatchewan case that went through there, which was split, it wasn't unanimous. It was made clear within that case that really, in some ways, that case could not fully show exactly how a province could deal with it. Alberta is coming forward with a long history of tackling emission management, and frankly, we're probably the only jurisdiction that could manage Alberta's emissions. The reality is, because of our largest industry, the oil and gas industry, we deal with way more volume when it comes to this issue, way more facilities, and more industrial partners that we have to partner with on this. And I think we'll be able to present to the court that we actually have a clear path forward on managing climate change, which is at the core of our argument of why the federal government should not be entering provincial jurisdiction on this issue.
Is that really, though, a legal argument? And I just want to point out that I know you're saying it's a split decision, but the court made a decision. That decision is being appealed. I mean, it's still the decision of the court, even though the judges decided differently. Overall, the court decided in favor of the federal government. Is the argument you're putting forth really a legal one, considering it's a jurisdictional issue here? That the federal government is claiming that it has the jurisdiction to be able to manage emissions in this country. How is your argument any different?
Well, I see it slightly, that certainly is part of the argument, but there's also an argument on whether or not you have to use, whether or not the federal government can enforce carbon taxes on provinces if provinces have other solutions to be able to tackle emissions, and that's my point.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Minister Nixon. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me on.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.